the fourth installment where I talk about the various aspects of the debt ceiling which I label as a fraud. And in this video we're going to talk about some of the legal aspects of this. Some I have talked about before, such as the 14th Amendment, but I'm going to go a little bit further with that in order to try to give my listeners and my viewers a clearer view of just exactly what I think is going on here on the opposing side. So let's get started. First, let me say the actual diabolical thing about the Constitution is that it is founded on very good principles of freedom of expression and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, these principles have been used as a mere veneer or a facade to facilitate the depredations of rich men in controlling the government. And unfortunately, this is something that has occurred almost immediately, and it was happening under the Articles of Confederation as well as the Constitution. But that's another video. So on we go. This, by the way, is why this act has been waggishly named the Make America Default Act. Because as I said in another video, it is completely stupid. In fact, it is terminally stupid. It has no chance of passing. But again, that's the idea, and we're going to go over that again in just a moment, why that is and what that is about and what exactly is behind that. So in other words, the connection of this is, and it's a long-lasting connection at that. At the end of the Civil War, the South was militarily defeated. There were among them many who, as their subsequent hate behavior was observed by the rest of the body politic, came to be called and are still called today unreconstructed. And when we say unreconstructed, we mean they did not learn the lessons of the Civil War. These were the lost cause types, these were the South shall rise again types, and they learned none of the lessons that they should have learned. And I think that over the course of upwards of 150 years, people have forgotten what these lessons are and what it means to be unreconstructed. And I think that they have attributed it to things like racism, which is certainly true. That is certainly a lesson that they did not learn. The proscription of the political power, and when I say that, what I mean is the individual franchise that we all as citizens of the United States have, which manifests itself probably most directly in being able to vote in an election. I think we would all agree from what we have seen that they didn't learn that lesson very well either. And that means that they're unreconstructed. And once again, I go along with that. I don't have any argument with these first two things. And I think that the word has come to be related also to social and cultural mores, like, for example, the fact that the British chivalric tradition existed in the South before the Civil War, and that may be things that I won't mention specifically are connected to those, and that those should have been done away with, and they have not been done away with. All this is a reason to ascribe to the people the word unreconstructed. And this may be right, and I'm not going to comment on it further except to say that. But nevertheless, I think there is an absolute positive primary lesson that the South should have learned. And they only partly learned it, or they applied it only in the most literal sense. And the one that you could argue that they learned was that you don't wage a military war against the Union. But the other extension of that, which they definitely didn't learn, is that you can wage another kind of war against the Union. And that war is a financial conflict. And this is the point of referring to these as unreconstructed. My point anyway, because when I look at it, it is apparent to me that the only thing they learned was how to wage war against the United States. And that is a financial, and that is what they are doing, and you are seeing it now. And that is why you see so many of the states of the South and their elected representatives happily being contrary, essentially waging this war. And it's like Clausewitz said, politics is like a war. And he's right. So in other words, the bottom line on this is if you try to destroy the Union by force of arms, it will fail, but you can always try to do so by means of bankruptcy. And that's okay. You're still waging the conflict. You're still using financial weapons. You're still being true to the South. The January 6th insurrection in Congress have learned nothing. They tried on January 6th using violence, and now they're using financial weapons, other means. This is just a continuation of the attempt of January 6th. Okay, now let's list some of the ways that I told you that make the attempt of these reactionary and fascist elements, as I've described it, as terminally stupid. First of all is the premise that the Constitution overpowers all statutes. This is a well-settled principle of law. Some people have argued about the nature of the Constitution, whether it is a statute or not. I personally argue that it is in fact a statute, but for the sake of this argument, whether it is or whether it isn't actually does not matter. But even people who would argue against the premise that the Constitution is in itself a statute would readily agree that the idea of the Constitution is to say what laws can be made and what laws cannot be made. My argument is good either way, and let's take it from that point of view. And what it means is that pursuant to the 14th Amendment, Section 4, which says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is what it says, that the public debt of the United States legally contracted shall not be questioned. You cannot have an inferior law, such as, for example, any other statute, that can be argued to legally contravene and stop that. that. Otherwise, you would be violating the intent of the Constitution. This would open a veritable Pandora's box, a real can of worms for every bit of legislation on the books, arguably since the country ever was started. So that is an absurd result, and we'll be getting to talk more about absurdities in just a moment. But that is an absurd result. The law does not allow for such kinds of results. Bottom line, the Constitution overpowers statute in the same way as the old game that we all learned as children, rock, paper, scissors. We learned that scissors cut paper and rock breaks scissors. It's exactly the same thing here. Second of all is the premise that was articulated by the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who, as someone said, is arguably the greatest economist of the 18th century, or even on either side of the 18th century, that an unfunded public debt is actually a good thing. It is something that the United States wants, and the concomitant pledge that the United States is good for it is something that you also want. And the reason you want this is because it means that you have a responsible entity that is going to pay its bills, and that this, plus the action of making payments, is very much part of extending the constitutional principle of full faith and credit to the entire world. So forget this kitchen table type economics, which is the reductio ad absurdum argument that these reactionary and fascist elements who have suborned and taken over the Republican Party and who are masquerading as conservatives. Forget this argument. We're talking here about macrocosmic entities. The entire world doesn't fall into economic chaos if an individual family isn't able to make its payments on time. The entire country and the entire world does fall into chaos if the country is not able to make its debt payments. Anybody who thinks for a moment should be able to understand that there is a difference there. So in other words, this is more absurdity masquerading as responsible argument. Now, the second basis for me saying that the Make America Default Act is both terminally stupid, completely unworkable, and obviously politically motivated with a view towards destroying the United States is what is known as the constitutional avoidance principle. And this principle says that you should always avoid violating the Constitution if at all possible, and only in the most dire and unavoidable of circumstances should you violate the United States Constitution, if another solution is at all possible. This kind of dovetails with the absurdity principle and is something I want you to keep in mind as we go through some of these things here, because you're going to see that in the end, not only are these things violated with the constitutional principle legislated, but they're all absurd and they lead to a tortured, twisted, and disastrous result that, as I said, pretty much anybody can understand. You don't need a degree in economics or government to understand the consequences of this. The imposition of a debt ceiling, the holding of arguably not only the country, but the world hostage to a selfish sectionalism and desire are not legitimate reasons to violate the United States Constitution. As I say in the historical background video, which I encourage you to review for the United States to go into default, would be a social, cultural, political, and geopolitical catastrophe, not only for the United States, but also the world. It would end the hegemony of the United States, and it would open the way for a far more malevolent player, like the Chinese Communists, for example, under the dictator president for life Xi, the revanchist Russian Federation under the criminal oligarch Putin, and other criminal oligarchs who run the Russian Federation. It includes the Middle Eastern potentates such as Saudi Arabia, and I go over all this more in the historical backgrounds video. And so here, all I will say is that if you don't like the hegemony of the United States, go ahead and do this. See what happens. See how you would like the hegemony of the criminals of these other regimes. I guarantee you, you will pray and you will beg for the return of the hegemony of the United States over world affairs. So this is rank absurdity. You don't have to have much background in politics, again, to understand what a disaster and what a catastrophe such a thing would be based on what I just described, which are very real and probable consequences and not just something I made up as an alternative argument. These eventualities are very likely to occur to a greater or lesser extent should the United States default on its debt. Now, the next thing I wanted to discuss is the basic thing that the reactionary and fascist elements of the Republican Party are relying on in the Make America Default Act, and that is the Liberty Bond Act of 1917. And what a stunningly weak and pretend artifice this is to support the view of the debt ceiling. And I might add, it is so stunning and so weak that you almost cannot understand unless you have it explained to you how it is that the reactionary and fascist right could ever use it. But here's the simple, and it is, believe me, it is the simple explanation for this. So in other words, the idea of the 1917 Liberty Bond Act, that it contains a ceiling provision, and this is basically just an issue provision. In other words, so many millions of dollars can be raised, and if you're going to go beyond that, you have to seek the approval of Congress. But this is such a thin thing because it's a bond issue. And yes, it is United States Treasury securities. But I'm telling you, this is an artifice that is designed to facilitate borrowing on a specific instance and not generally speaking, not for the general welfare. It's an act designed to facilitate borrowing for war, for the purposes of war, which is an extraordinary and not usual expenditure and which is not a part of the overall and comprehensive borrowing of the United States. And the whole idea of it is to allow for additional borrowing. And this is, as I said, and not to limit borrowing. So it's really kind of stupid. As I said, it's an artifice. It's thin. Because if you were looking for an example of a statute that you can use to justify a limit on borrowing, why would you use a statute whose clear purpose was to make it easier for the country to borrow? And it's what they're relying on, and it's just as simple as that. Once again, terminally stupid. Next, there is also the legal principle that if you get to the end of a process and the result violates other laws, then you have to turn away from it. So, for example, and this goes hand in hand with what I said before, which is the absurdity principle, and which is something I want you to keep in mind as I go over these things, because all these things propose absurd and tortured results. So going forward, based on this premise, if a law proposes an absurd result, like the bankruptcy of the United States, you have to turn away from it. Furthermore, in order to go forward this, you're going to be unavoidably violating several laws that already exist, that predate this situation. Like, for example, the Social Security Act of 1935, like the National Defense Authorization and Appropriation Act, which was first passed in 1961 and has been in continual operation since that time. Yet another one is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as the Affordable Care Act, which is more recent, but it was passed in 2010 and has now been in existence for 13 years. As you probably know, the ACA provides much needed reform of the existing mechanisms, or of the then existing mechanisms, for the populace to receive health care, including but not limited to 10 basic things that every health insurance policy has to guarantee, such as ambulatory patient services, outpatient where you can get without being admitted to the hospital, emergency services, hospitalization, overnight services, pregnancy, maternity, newborn care, before and after birth, mental health care, substance abuse disorder services, prescription drugs, rehabilitative and habilitative services and devices to help people who are afflicted with chronic conditions in order to gain or recover physical or mental skills, laboratory services, preventive and wellness services for people with chronic condition, pediatric services, including oral and vision care. All these things are guaranteed. But if the United States default, we are not going to be able to pay for that. And here is where it really gets very plainly absurd in a way that pretty much anybody of ordinary intelligence can understand. So, in other words, in order to get what you want, you're not going to fund the military. So, in other words, you're not going to pay the soldiers. You're going to invalidate the entire Social Security Act of 1935 with all its various permutations, which will throw literally well upwards of 100 million Americans into a terrible living situation, unable to bear the cost of their care, their medicines, etc., which the Republican Party has by and large facilitated by, in the first place, by refusing to allow costs to be controlled. And as you do this, you should ask in the same breath almost whether they are willing to propose that they themselves, members of Congress, should perhaps go without pay, should perhaps go without benefits, should perhaps go without the various per diem, the franking privileges, etc., which are a part of their remuneration. Do you think that they would vote for that? And of course the answer is they would not vote for that. They would say that that is absurd. So if they think that is absurd, why should we vote for this? Why should we allow it? Why should we allow them to override our clear financial interests when they are not even willing to show common cause with the rest of the people in the country and override theirs? So since I have brought that up, let's go over once again what we talked about in the previous video on historical background. Get some of you who need some repetition on that, which would be understandable, up to date. So in other words, taking this further, we have a situation where, because I know that at least on the right, this is something that a lot of people are into, segueing briefly into the realm of religion, and don't worry, we won't be there long. In the book of Revelation, it has this statement and it talks about nations that give their power to another nation. But discussing this for a minute, what power might that be that they're referring to? Well, using the previous metaphor and following it to its logical conclusion, what do you think holds this world hegemony that the United States has together? Well, I propose that, quite simply, it is economics. It is money. It is monetary power, pure and simple. It's been that way since 1945 and the Bretton Woods Accords, and it has continued this way. At that time, the United States was the creditor of last resort, and things switched, and it became the debtor of last resort, and why that happened is something that we won't go into now. But it was still necessary and still important, and the world still subscribed to it. And that's what it is. If you do what the Freedom Caucus yahoos want to, for example, which is basically just to go into default, which is what President Trump recently said, it's going to destroy that hegemony. And this is what I mean when I say that this would have disastrous consequences for the world, not only economically, but as far as political or geopolitical stability is concerned. Because if that happens and the United States had your money sales, you're going to have people looking this way and that, trying to find out who they're going to align themselves with. And the only other alternatives are China, the Russian Federation, and also the medieval potentates of the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia. And that's why it's not an option to default, even though technically we're servicing a massive amount of interest on the debt. But we have to keep paying it, and that is why we have to keep paying it. Because if we don't, it is all going to fall apart. And literally that plunges us into the abyss, plunges us into the black hole of unknowability about what comes next. That ultimately is why the plan of the Freedom Caucus and these other yahoos in the House is unworkable, because that's the result. That's what it does to us in the final analysis. Once again, Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury, says she wishes that the 14th Amendment didn't exist and that applying the 14th Amendment would cause a constitutional crisis, which is crazy because it puts you in the awkward position of having to justify how following the Constitution causes a constitutional crisis. The Secretary of the Treasury really should be out front on this stuff, but she's not. And she makes statements like this, and she is a banker, and her loyalty is more to the Federal Reserve and the money power behind the Federal Reserve more than it is to anything else. And you have to pay attention to that, and you have to acknowledge it, and you have to take it into account when you're reasoning about the situation that we have right now. Yellen should be out in front on this, should be advocating holding the auctions. She should be right behind advising President Biden to do this. Finally, there have been some arguments that using the 14th Amendment would not pass judicial muster, but honestly, I think this is a false argument, and it's really something that would backfire, especially on the Supreme Court, if such a case were to be brought to them, because of the comments of some of the members in recent years that they are all originalists now. That's the comment, without getting into a long thing about this, because once again, this deserves its own video, and actually, I believe I've already made a video about this. Originalism and textualism very much smack of legal positivism rather than the natural law, which it states in the Declaration of Independence that this country should be governed by. Now, originalists and textualists, although there are some small differences, basically believe that the law should stand as it is written, and no changes should be made, and that it is a judge's duty simply to interpret what is already written down and to go no further. Aside from the fact that this is an incredibly alarming comment, which deserves its own video, again, I don't think the Supreme Court would want to touch this if it came before them with a 10-foot pole. And they would not want to touch it for just this reason. Because when you research the legislative history of the 14th Amendment, which is the basis for a concept that goes all the way back to the Articles of Confederation, the results would show everybody the intent of it. And both originalists and textualists say that what they believe is the plain language of what is written in the Constitution. Therefore, the plainest interpretation of the 14th Amendment, Section 4, would strongly lend itself to the opinion that any debt ceiling is unconstitutional, and that the amendment means just what it says, that the public debt of the United States must be paid. Well, okay, I think we have finally come to the end of this long stream of videos to address this extremely important problem that the reactionary and fascist elements that have suborned the Republican Party have tried to hold the country and the world hostage now for well over a decade, because they've brought this up several times over the past 10 or so years. And it is my hope in making these videos that I have brought the pertinent issues to the attention of the American people, and that this will help them to stand up and make these opinions known, because it's a long since time that this lever, which is the same word that Abraham Lincoln used to describe slavery, may finally, once and for all, be broken in the faces of these reactionaries and these fascists. Now, as usual, stay tuned for my brief little surmise about how important it is and how much I appreciate you subscribing and how you can support me. I'll see you in just a second. with Politics by Jake, and I wanted to thank you for watching the video and ask you that if you like what you see, you like what you're hearing on this, ask you to please subscribe and also support me. And one of the ways that you can do that is by going to the URL that I put right below here on the screen, www.jakelaw.me. Now, I'm a business advisor with 30 years experience in law, business, and real estate. And I have great products and services for people who either own a business, and that's any business, by the way, not just a real estate business, who want to start a business, once again, that's any business, and or who want to grow wealth, which one of the very best ways to do that remains real estate, and who want their business, their property, and their wealth protected in the absolute positive best way possible, using secrets that only millionaires and billionaires know how to use. So I hope to see you over there at www.jakelaw.me, where you can sign up for a free 15-minute consultation real soon. And thanks once again for watching my videos.